many of us have fond memories of that special grandparent. And for me, it was my grandma, Jenny Saunders. She was the best granny ever. She would love to play pirates, and this came from being raised in a small Welsh seaport town. My granny was the illegitimate child of the town floozy, quite honestly, and she was raised by aunties and friends, and she was more or less scrambled rather than raised. And I think that this had long-lasting impact on her. She loved to play and had a great imagination, and in her later years was a very prolific writer and poet. But she never learned to cook. The year that I was 5, I was blessed with the opportunity to live during the school week with my granny. Well, that was the best thing for a 5-year-old ever, because she was always full of stories. And at bedtime, she'd tuck me in with a kiss on the forehead and sit down to tell me my bedtime story. Amazingly enough, they often started with, "Once upon a time, there was a very naughty little girl." And surprisingly, that naughty little girl would have a day very similar to mine. Who knew? And in the morning, she would gently wake me up. "Sweetheart, it's time to get up and go to kindergarten." And then the day would take a drastic turn because it was time for breakfast. My granny was a terrible, 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 worse than terrible cook. For breakfast, we would have a cup of tea and an egg. Well, for Granny, being raised in poverty and scrambled about the neighborhood, for her, a cup of tea was not that robust, beautiful English breakfast tea. Oh no, it was 4 tea flakes put in a large pot with water poured over it and immediately put into the cup with hot water to top it up. It barely colored the water. And the egg, well, she just didn't have time for cooking, and she didn't have 4 minutes for a 4-minute egg. Oh no, the egg was put into a cup and the leftover hot water was poured in it. By the time she had made her pseudo tea, she pulled it out, put it in a little egg cup, my favorite with the chick on it, in front of my place setting and whacked off the top. Yuck! It was raw and runny and nasty and disgusting. To this day, I cannot eat soft boiled eggs because I start to hallucinate and have nightmares over my horrible kindergarten breakfasts. Oh, but then I'd go off to kindergarten. We would walk happily down the street 7 blocks to the little church basement. And then at noon, she would come and pick me up, and she would tell me stories and little ditties and poems that she'd written during the day as we walked home. And one day I said to her, "Granny, how come you're always happy?" "Well," she said, "sweetheart, it's because I think I'm like a glowworm." I said, "Really? What do you mean?" And out came a little ditty. "I wish I was a glowworm, 'cause a glowworm's never glum. How can you be unhappy when the sun shines out your bum?" Oh, my granny said bum. Oh, that became my new favorite word. Well, after a lunch of moldy bread and some suspect filling, we would go out to play for the afternoon. Behind her house, she had a little garden area and a swamp. And we would play pirates. We'd put on eye patches and newspaper hats, and we would go through the swamp looking for intruders. I think this might have been one of her favorite games, living in the seaport. Sometimes she would cut the bulrushes, and we would sit in the sun on the side of the hill, and she would braid together the bulrushes and then sew them and make me hats. I had the most marvelous bulrush hats. But then it would be time for supper. Oh, that was dreadful. That was dreadful. One of her favorite things that she liked to do for supper was to make pancakes. I mean, seriously, pancakes. But she had no patience for cooking. So she would mix up the batter, put a spoon of batter into the pan, flip it over before it was ready, and then she'd start squishing it with the spatula to make it cook faster. We could have put shakes on the garage with Granny's pancakes. They were very robust and they stuck to your ribs, your teeth, your tongue, your adenoids, and everything else. They were really awful. And then would come a bedtime story. I was so fortunate. And on some weekends, I got to stay there all weekend where we would go and explore through the parks. We'd go for walks to visit her dotty old friends. And then I got to go to Sunday school with her, where she was the Sunday school teacher and brought all of her joy and storytelling ability to the little Bible stories. Her cookies that she brought to Sunday school were just as appetizing as the pancakes. How do you wreck a cookie? I don't know. I never learned that secret. And when she would make pie, again, it was a dreadful experience. I remember one time she brought pie to one of our family dinners, and as my dad manfully cut through it, little did he know he was actually cutting through the solid aluminum pie pan on the bottom. And he just looked up with benevolence in his eyes and said, "Mother, I think you've outdone yourself this time." Oh, the wonderful memories of being with my granny. But in her later years, her cooking abilities or lack of cooking abilities went down even further. I'll never forget the last meal that I had with her. My dad and I went to visit her in her little apartment in her last years. And she pulled out from the very back of this fridge this little knobbly piece of ham that had probably been there, I'm guessing, for a year, maybe 3. And as she pulled it out, she gently trimmed off the green iridescence that had started to grow on the one side and said, "That's okay. I just trim off the green bits and the rest of it is just fine." And as I helped her with the dishes, I could only remember when I was a child how she would entertain me as we did the dishes together with her own little poem of, "Thank God for dirty dishes. They have a tale to tell. When other folks go hungry, we live so very well. With health and hearth and happiness, we really shouldn't fuss. It is this stack of evidence that shows God's so very good to us." My granny, famous for raw eggs and green ham. Oh, what precious memories. Madam Toastmaster.